Clear.
If you're like most students, you probably find VORs confusing and complicated. This is usually due to a lack of understanding of some of the fundamental principles behind how a VOR works. VORs are confusing at first, but as you gain familiarity with the system, you'll find they are actually a very simple form of navigation. This video is a complete guide to take anyone from zero understanding of a VOR to being able to comfortably use any VOR for navigation. At some point you've probably heard that VORs are being decommissioned and they're getting phased out because of the increased reliability of GPS. And although that is partially true, they are not going away entirely. And so we do need to know how to use a VOR and all of the procedures applicable to them. We currently have the minimum operational network in place, so there's a set of airports around the United States that will have ground-based nav aids like VORs, instrument landing systems, all designed to get you down to the ground in instrument conditions, provided a GPS outage occurs. And so as long as the minimum operational network exists, and we will always have VORs. Okay, so before we jump in the simulator and talk about how we actually fly using a VOR, we first need to understand what a VOR is. And so a VOR stands for Very High Frequency Omnidirectional Range. It is a ground-based navigational aid, and these are located all over the United States. As far as the building on the ground, we're looking at these white witch hat looking structures. So in order to receive signal from the VOR, you need to be within line of sight with the station. Here we're looking at figure 16-28 from the Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, and you can see that the curvature of the Earth can be a driving factor in your ability to not receive a VOR signal. Now this is a much blown out of proportions scale photo here. Obviously we're not using two VORs from the other sides of the Earth, but on a smaller scale we're talking about two VORs within, let's say 100 nautical miles of each other. If you're at a low enough altitude, oftentimes the curvature of the Earth is great enough that you don't actually have line of sight with those VORs, and so you're not going to receive signal. So all that to say, the higher altitude you go, the more chance that you'll have getting adequate signal with the VOR station. There are three different types of VORs. We have just the standard VOR. Then we also have a VOR DME, which is the basic VOR with distance measuring equipment attached to it. So we can figure out our distance from the VOR. And then the third one is the VORTAC. And a VORTAC is fundamentally the same thing as a VOR DME for us civilian pilots. The difference is that the VORTAC is also a TACAN, and the TACAN is used by military aircraft for their own navigation. And so for us civilian pilots, again, it is fundamentally the same thing as a VOR DME. So when we're talking about VORs and identifying them on a sectional chart, we can look here at the Thurman VOR, and we can see that it is a VORTAC based on the symbology and the key that we just looked at a second ago. And we can see that there's a compass rose that is circling the VOR. So a VOR is going to emit 360 courses. We call these courses radials. And here I have just drawn out 12 of those radials, but again, there's 360 of them, each radial representing 1 degree. And so the point of a VOR is to be able to navigate a straight line course directly to or directly away from the VOR. Now again, there's 360 of these radials, and so we have to remember that each radial has a corresponding reciprocal that shares the same course. Let me show you what I mean by that. So if I look at the next slide here, we have the 360 radial and the 180 radial. We can see that together, both of these radials form a straight line. In other words, it's the same exact course, but it's two separate radials. So really, although we have 360 radials, really we have 180 different courses that we can navigate on. So let's look at the components in the airplane that relate to our VOR. The first thing that we need is a radio, a VHF radio that supports VOR navigation. And so in this case we have on nav 1, we've got the 114.4 frequency programmed, which is going to correspond to the Akron VOR. With the nav radio, we can listen to the Morse code identified on the sectional chart for the Akron VOR. So we click on nav 1 on the radio, and there was the Morse code. So we've identified it. And then if we come over here, we come across an instrument called an Omni Bearing Selector, or OBS for short. With the OBS, we can see a compass card, and this compass card is going to reflect the radial which we want to select to fly. We have a yellow triangle at the top that points to the radial that we're choosing. So in this case, let's say want to select the 120 radial. I can select 120 by just simply aligning the yellow triangle with the 120. And then you'll notice there's a little bit of movement with the needle here. This vertical needle is called a course deviation indicator, or a CDI. The CDI is telling us how many degrees off course we are. And so if we look at this horizontal bar, we have 5 dots either side of center. Each dot represents 2 degrees of course deflection. So we got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 degrees is going to be our max deflection. Right now, looking at our 120 radial, we are about 9, coming up on 10 degrees off course. And so if I wanted to get on my 120 radial, I would turn to the south to re-intercept that course, and then I would join that 120 radial. The other thing we have here is a to from indication. So when we select a radial and the airplane is physically located on this half, meaning we're on, in this case, between the 030 radial and the 210 radial, we're in that half of the circle, then we're going to expect to see a from indication. So we are on the same side as the radial that we chose. If I flip this 180 degrees, so I'm going to put the 300 up at the top here. We're going to see that the needle switches sides, and we have a to indication. So now what we're saying is I am located physically, the airplane is physically located somewhere on this half of the circle. So we're on the opposite side from the desired radial that we selected. And navigationally, this makes sense. If we were somewhere to the southeast of the VOR and we wanted to navigate to it on the 300 radial, then we would have to be flying to the VOR on a 300 course until we cross. Once we cross past the VOR, that to indication switches sides because we've now entered the northwest side of the VOR. So all you're doing here with the OBS is you're selecting the radial that you want the system to show you your position in relation to. So this is showing my position in relation to the 180 radial. This is showing my position in relation to the 280 radial. Now, one of the things I haven't mentioned with this instrument is this horizontal bar and this window that says GS, and it's got the barber pole. This particular instrument also does vertical navigation. It's more specifically for an instrument landing system, or an ILS, or if you had it paired to the GPS, you could fly a GPS approach that offers vertical guidance. And so this horizontal bar is just telling you your altitude deviation. Now, for VORs specifically, VORs are only going to be lateral navigation. There's never going to be an altitude component with it, and so we will never expect to see the horizontal bar and the glide slope indicator flag to change. It should always look like this when we're navigating with VORs. If we look at the indicator just below this, this is it for our nav2 source, so we can use two VORs at the same time. The one down here doesn't have that horizontal bar, and so this, for us, when we're using a VOR, is really all we need. We just need to have the vertical bar, the vertical CDI specifically, and that is going to give us our lateral navigation, our lateral course guidance, as well as the to from indicator. So when using a VOR, the very first thing that we're going to want to do is to tune and identify the station. And so if we zoom in on, let's say, the Thermin VOR, we get a box, and this is a Vortec. So we have a box here that says Thermin, that's the name of the VOR. And then the second line, the first thing we see is a 112.9, and that is the VOR frequency that you're going to put into your radio. To the right of that, we see channel 76. This, for us civilian pilots, is not going to apply to us because we do not use channels with our radios. To the right of that, we see the letters TXC, Tango X-Ray Charlie, and that is going to be the identifier, the three-letter identifier for the VOR. And then to the right of that, we see some dashes and dots, and those are going to be the Morse code that we're going to use to identify the station utilizing our radios. I want to make a quick note as well that anytime you have a GPS that also integrates into the Omni bearing selector indicator, you should make sure that you have your GPS set to VLOC mode anytime you're trying to use the VORs. If you had it in GPS mode, then the GPS navigation is going to correlate to the CDI movement on your Omni bearing selector. So in the simulator here, we can see we are just to the northwest of the Thermin VOR, and let's say we want to navigate utilizing that Thermin VOR. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the box, and we're going to plug in the 112.9 into our nav radio. So we'll go to 112.9. We'll activate it, and we can see some things happen on our Omni bearing selector here. So we have identified that we're receiving a signal, and if I look at the GPS here, we can see that the GPS has electronically identified TXC. It has identified the Thermin VOR. Additionally, we can also go to the Nav1 radio and listen to that Morse code. So I'll let it play again. Okay, so we've listened to the Morse code, we've identified that we are receiving the correct VOR. And so the next thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to select the desired course which we want to fly. In this case, I'm going to say let's just navigate directly to the Thermin VOR. And so in order to do that, we're going to take a look at our Omni bearing selector, and we're going to spin the dial until we center our course deviation indicator, the CDI. And we want to center it with a 2 indication. So if you start spinning the OBS knob and the needle centers up and you have a from indication, then continue to turn that knob 180 degrees until you have a centered CDI needle with a 2 indication. So now if I wanted to go to the Thermin VOR, I could just fly a course of about 139 degrees, and that would take me directly to the VOR. So if I come down to my heading indicator and I select our heading to go 139, currently got the autopilot in heading select mode. Turning the airplane to the 139 degrees here will turn us on to the 139 radial. And because I have calm winds, the airplane will continue to fly the 139 heading, and it should line up with the 139 radial, or at least be really close to it. There's going to be some minor differences between the magnetic heading and the VOR's magnetic course. That is due to the fact that magnetic north is always changing, and the VORs, when they are built, they're accurate at the time that they're built as far as aligning with magnetic north. But as the years progress and magnetic north moves, the VORs no longer line up exactly with magnetic north. So if we look at the sectional chart, we can see that the airplane is pointing to and heading to the Thermin VOR. And so in this case, we look at the Omni bearing selector, and we can see that our CDI is deflected just slightly to the right. So if I wanted to re-intercept our course and continue to track on our 139 radial, I could make a slight right turn, and that will re-intercept me, so that needle should center up right over the dots. And once that centers up, we'll turn back to our 139 and we'll continue to track inbound to the VOR. If we had wind, then we would have to factor wind drift into our navigation. So a good rule of thumb is that your heading should be very similar, but not necessarily exact, to the radial that you have selected on your Omni bearing selector. If they are 180 degrees off, then you are going to be in a reverse sensing situation, where you're tracking the reciprocal radial on your OBS compared to the course that you're actually flying. So our CDI has now centered up again. We'll go ahead and make that left turn and go back to our 139 heading, and we'll track this all the way inbound to the station. Okay, so as we can see, we are now approaching the Thermin VOR, and what we're looking for as we get closer is the to from indicator to switch. So as we cross over the Thermin VOR, the only positive way for us to identify that we've truly passed the station is to see that to indicator switch to a from indicator. We're also going to see this needle get really sensitive. So I've left the airplane in I've left the airplane in heading mode, and as we overfly that VOR, the CDI is going to probably deflect fully left and right, and then eventually we'll see that to from indicator switch, indicating that we've passed the station. And then as we continue to fly outbound on this heading, we'll eventually see the CDI center back up. It's important to not chase the needle when the needle deflects fully to left and right and goes back and forth like that when we're close to the VOR. We call that the cone of confusion, because there's a tendency for pilots to want to chase that needle. But it's just because the needle is so sensitive when we're over top the station that we just want to continue flying our heading outbound and let the needle come back to us. That way we keep the airplane stabilized and under control. So looking at my drawing here, we can see that if you are close to the VOR, the gap between radials is going to be a lot smaller than, say, way out in the distance. That gap gets much, much larger. And so this has to do with your sensitivity of the needles. The further away you get from the VOR, the less sensitive your CDI becomes. And the closer you are to the VOR, the more sensitive your CDI becomes. In terms of actually figuring out a proper distance you might be off course, we utilize the 60-to-1 rule. And so the 60-to-1 rule states that if you are 60 nautical miles from the VOR, then 1 degree off course equals 1 nautical mile off course. Or in other words, 1 dot equals 2 nautical miles at 60 nautical miles away. It is a 60-to-1 ratio. Let's say we were at 15 nautical miles. What would our distance be between each degrees? Well, 60 divided by 4 equals 15, so then we take 1 divided by 4 as well, and you get 0.25, or 1/4 mile would be 1 degree deflection on the CDI. So again, the closer you get to the VOR, the more sensitive the CDI becomes. The further away, the less sensitive it is. Alright, we're continuing to get even closer now. We're within 1 mile of the VOR. We can see that CDI needle slowly starting to drift to the right. And we'll just continue to fly our heading. We're not going to go chase the needle. There's full deflection. You can see some things happening here on our to from indicator as we're over top of it, and there we go. We're now at a from indication, so we have passed the VOR, and as we continue to fly away from it, we are decreasing sensitivity of our CDI because we're getting further away, and we just continue on our 139 heading, and we'll end up back on our 139 radial. And as you get further away, if the needle doesn't quite center up nicely, we can just make a slight turn. I'm only doing about 3 degrees of a heading change here to re-intercept our radial. Just like that. So now let's say we want to intercept a predetermined radial. So I've already tuned and identified, and if I go to the sectional chart, let's say I want to fly the 060 radial outbound. So looking at the compass rose on the sectional chart, we can see the 06 radial. And if I go back to the airplane and we look at the Omni bearing selector, we can select the 060. And then I already know that I'm to the south of the VOR. So if I want to turn and intercept, then I can go ahead and just make a heading change. And initially here, let's make it a pretty steep intercept here. So we'll go to like a north heading. As you get closer, a good recommended intercept angle is 30 degrees. I just know that I'm pretty far to the south right now, and so by turning directly north, I'll get to that course a lot faster. And the reason that we generally don't want to intercept more than that 30 degrees is because as soon as the needle becomes alive, meaning it's coming inward from full deflection, the turn to intercept, if it's more than 30 degrees, we run a good risk of blowing past that course, that radial. And so now that we get closer, I'm going to go ahead and make that 30-degree intercept. So we're going to turn to a 030 heading now. All right, if we look at our sectional chart, we are coming up on the 070 radial, and looking at our dots of deflection, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dots of deflection, so that's 10 degrees off course. So as we approach the 060 radial, and we're currently passing the 070 radial, we should start to see this CDI needle come alive and start to swing inward. So there's the 070 radial now, and there's the needle starting to move. And because we're on a 30-degree intercept, the needle's coming in nice and slow, nice and controlled. And so we're going to try to time it so that we make our turn from 030 heading to 060 when that needle centers up. And it's important to note, as you're making your turn, your rate of closure will continue to slow up, and so your needle movement should slow down. So depending on how far away you are from your VOR, that'll determine how quickly this CDI needle centers up. If you're very far away, the needle will center up very slowly, and so sometimes maybe a more aggressive intercept angle would be necessary. If it's coming in really, really quickly, then a shallower intercept angle would be more appropriate. But for here, we're only about 12 miles away from the VOR. We were at a 30-degree intercept angle. I turned it right 10 degrees, so now we're on a 040 heading, and we can see that needle's coming in very slowly. So I'll just leave the 20-degree intercept in a little bit further. And as it's getting closer, we'll go ahead and we'll make a turn maybe 050, and we'll just take it all the way to the 060 actually. That needle's centering up nicely, and we're coming up on 060. And so just like that, we're now intercepted the 060 radial, and we are tracking it outbound. Now, chances are, again, you're going to have wind, and when you have wind, you're not going to necessarily know the wind correction angle right off the bat. And so the first thing you're going to do is you're going to fly your outbound heading that matches the radial you have selected. And then as that needle decides to swing away because of wind drift, you're going to make a turn back to intercept, and then you're just going to, through trial and error, essentially find that wind correction angle that holds the needle stationary. So it's kind of a repetitive process of turning to re-intercept your course until you finally find that wind correction angle that holds it perfectly. So let's say I'm flying along on my cross country and I get lost. I have a general idea of where I'm at, but I'm not 100% sure. And so looking at my sectional chart, I know that I'm somewhere near these two VORs. I've got the Akron VOR up here on the north side, and then on the south side there's the Thurman VOR. And I know I'm in the general vicinity of these, but I'm not exactly sure where. So the way I can use VORs to determine my location is to first tune up one of the VORs. So I will start with the Akron VOR. So we will do 114.4, and we will activate it. And you can see it's already been identified by the GPS, so we don't have to worry about doing the Morse code. And I'm going to select center the needle with a from indication, which will be that 127 course. Okay, so the 127, and then I'm going to go to the Thermin VOR on nav 2, which is 112.9. And I've got to listen to Morse code. Okay, that looks good. And we will now center this with a from indication. And we'll find where they both intersect again. So I recentered the first one. And I'm going to pause the simulator here, and we're going to look at the iPad. Again, there's the Akron VOR to the north, Thermin VOR to the south. And if we look at Akron, we are on the 122 radial. So I can draw a line from the 122 radial outbound. And then from the Thermin VOR, we're on the 029. So we're going to be somewhere in this area. And just to prove that it works, we can go back to the settings of ForeFlight, and we can turn on our own ship. And again, we get really close. Not perfect, but we can get really close. Part of that is going to be user error with drawing a straight line. Clearly, I can't do that very well on an iPad. But you get the idea. So if you were navigating using your paper charts and you got lost, you can always use VORs to triangulate your position. Now, let's say we wanted to check our progress along this way, or along this route. And so let's say we identify there's a road up ahead, and let's pretend there's a cloud layer underneath. We can't tell where that road is. We can utilize the cross radial by just drawing a line from our VOR to our waypoint, and we can see on the compass rose that we are crossing the 120 radial when we cross the road from the Akron VOR. So what I'll do is I'll take the nav 2 omni-bearing selector, and I'll select the 120. I'll unpause the sim so the needle comes out. So now the needle is off to the left, and as we continue to fly closer and closer to our road here, we're going to see the needle begin to center up. Once that needle centers up, we should be right over the road. And then as we continue to fly along, that needle will pass through center, and we'll just continue until it's fully deflected to the right side. And that means we've passed the road. So you can utilize a VOR to track your progress along a route. And this is especially useful when you're flying in more remote areas that don't necessarily have a lot of physical features to reference for when you're using your pilotage and dead reckoning. A lot of times we're using lakes, road intersections, towers, those kind of things. But occasionally you'll find yourself in areas that there's really not a whole lot of features to go off of. And so these cross radials are a way to make your own waypoints. And in this case, we're now past that 120. Look outside. Here's our road intersection. So, again, it's not an exact science. It's to get you close to it. And so, yeah, that is how you can utilize a VOR to track your progress. And so your next waypoint, you would just go to, your next radial that you planned for. So the 100, So the 100 radial puts us just beyond the little zigzag here. Okay, so let's talk about reverse sensing. So here I've got the airplane positioned north of the Akron VOR, and let's say when I'm centering up my needles, I'm not paying attention and I get it set up backwards. So I'm flying northbound here, and I've selected the 168, 169 radial. And let's say I'm flying that 347 reciprocal. When you're on your course, it looks correct. Your indicator should still be centered up, but your red flag here is going to be that your to indicator doesn't make sense. If I look at my sectional chart, I'm flying away from the VOR, so I would wish to see a from indicator here. So if I saw that, I would just flip the OBS 180 degrees so that I've got the 347 set at top here. But let's say I didn't notice that, and let's say I drifted to the left somehow. And so if I drift to the left from a 347 radial, we should see a decrease here. I should be on the 346 now. It'll be 345 here in just a second. But if I look at my CDI, my needle's deflecting to the left. Well, if I'm not referencing the radial on my GPS here and I'm just flying off of the CDI, the tendency for me would be to make a left turn to get back on course, and that's typically how we fly it. But because we have this set backwards, we are in a reverse sensing situation. So by flying the airplane to the left, the CDI needle goes to the left. And so if I wanted to get back on course with a reverse sensing situation, I would need to pretend that I am the CDI as opposed to the course representing my CDI, or the CDI representing my course. So I need to fly to the east to get back on that 347 radial, which again, what we have set up top is the reciprocal, so the 167. So in a normal setting, we pretend that the CDI is representing our course, and so when the CDI needle goes to the left, our course is to our left. In a reverse sensing situation, we flip that around, where the course deviation indicator represents us, and the center represents our course. And so I'm having to steer the airplane right to get my needle, representing me, back onto the desired radial, representing the center of our instrument here. So again, you're not going to find yourself doing reverse sensing operations on a regular basis. The only exception would be if you were to fly a localizer back course. When you fly a localizer, it's very similar to VOR navigation, but that is the only time that you would actually have a reverse sensing situation. Otherwise, you should always set your OBS to the course that matches the heading that you're going to fly, or the course that you're going to fly. So in this case, again, it's backwards. So we would, if I wanted to continue flying outbound on that 347, I should set the 347 on my OBS. And just like that, we've now set it properly, and and we're back to the normal way of thinking. We've got the from indication here. If I got to the left, of course, my CDI should deflect to the right, telling me that I should turn right to get back onto course. Alright, so a quick thing to note when it comes to DME. Most aircraft these days no longer are equipped with distance measuring equipment. Instead, we have a lot of aircraft that are equipped with GPS that offers distance information as a substitute. If you look at Advisory Circular 90-108, you will find that GPS is a substitution for DME, but GPS itself is not DME. And the reason we want to make a distinction about this is because DME is going to utilize radio waves as opposed to satellite data. And with DME, it is slant range that the distance measuring equipment is measuring, meaning it is measuring the line directly between the aircraft and the station, not the horizontal distance from the station to your position. Because we're using satellite position data with the GPS, we are receiving lateral distance with the GPS. So DME is going to have its own inaccuracies in the distance that we see, in that it's also, there's a component of the triangle that is your altitude. So when you get closer to your VOR DME or your VORTAC, and you have distance measuring equipment, the closer you get to it, the more skewed your data becomes. And eventually, when you get over top of the station, your distance is going to be a representation of your altitude above the station in nautical miles. Whereas if you're using GPS and you pass over the VORTAC or VOR DME, the GPS is going to give you the lateral distance. So if you're over top, your lateral distance will be 0. So there are inherent differences between the two, and it's important that we know what data we are receiving by which system. And I just want to make that quick note. Here in X-Plane, the 172 does not have the original distance measuring equipment, nor does it the 172 in the new Microsoft Flight Simulator have it, so I can't actually show you an example here, but just know that there is a difference, and it all depends on the systems in your aircraft. So that is where you need to be familiar with all of the avionics that you have and understand where that data is coming from. I hope you found this video to be helpful in your understanding of VOR navigation. If you did find it helpful, please like and comment on the video. If you're interested in seeing more educational content like this, please hit the subscribe button and click the bell icon so you'll be notified when a future video is released. And with that, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.